Let's talk about the new Spooky Friendoween collection from Dieverune Cosmetics. And I'm excited to show you, these are 2 palettes and single eyeshadows as well as 2 split liners that were curated by Monica, who is the owner of Dieverune Cosmetics, and Lee, aka Basket Case Beauty. And a couple years ago, they did their own BYOPs with these themes. So we have Warlock of the Wood, which was curated by Lee, and then Witch of the Wildflower, which is curated by Monica. And then there's also 6 single eyeshadows, so 3 for each theme, and then each theme also has a split pan water activated liner. And I will be showing you swatches of everything, and I will send the products in PR. And I am friends with Monica and Lee. I have known them for years, and I've known Monica since before she started the brand, and I did work on the packaging, and I just brought their visions to life. So I'm excited for Monica and Lee to have brought this idea from years ago, from a BYOP to an actual collection. So let's take a look at the color stories. Warlock of the Wood is more like pastels, grays, browns, and I love this color story, and I love that the shimmers are going down the center, and both of the palettes do have a little split pan kind of marbled eyeshadow. There are 2 shades, so you can of course use one on each side, or you can mix it together, or you can swirl your brush or finger and just mix them together. So this is definitely cooler tone vibes. And then the Witch of the Wildflower is a little bit more colorful. We have some purples, greens, and a really bright yellow, and again we have a split pan in the center, and I just love both of these color stories. I feel very inspired by them. Unfortunately, I was only able to do 1 look with each palette, but I will definitely be featuring these in a reel, so stay tuned for that. And as I mentioned, there's also 6 single eyeshadows, so we have these 3 which go with Witch of the Wildflower, and then these go with Warlock of the Wood. And I will be taking you through detailed swatches of each of the shimmer shades as well as comparison swatches, and I'm also going to show you how I created these 2 looks. But before that, let's get into the launch information. All the products are launching October 13 at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Each of the palettes is $39, which I think is an amazing price for these. Like, truly, that is a really good price. Plus you can use a 10% off discount code on top, and I do have a non-affiliated code which I will put up on the screen in case you're interested in any of the products. And then each of the single eyeshadows are $14, and then the wet liner is $9 each. So now let's get into all the details. Almost forgot to mention, they do have also these Halloween themed versions of their logo on empty compact, so you can get the single shadows with a compact if you would like. Starting off with Witch of the Wildflower single, and this one is Samhain, and it is a really beautiful, like kind of taupey, neutral, sparkly shadow, and it does feel a little bit squishy in the pan. And I'm going to be swatching 3 at a time, and it is so ultra sparkly. It does have a little bit of a shift. It is such an interesting shade, and it flashes like a really pale green straight on. Next shade is All Hallows Eve. I love this kind of shade, and this one does also feel squishy in the pan, and it's a little bit flaky, but it does completely smooth out. I'm going to go in with a second layer just to really see at full opacity what the shade looks like. And then the last shade is Friendoween, and this one is a marbled shade, so it's probably going to look differently depending, and it is quite flaky and chunky, and it is a little bit squishy in the pan, but it doesn't really feel like too emollient spreading it compared to this shade especially. And this is what it looks like all mixed together. It's basically a very pale purple with a shift all the way to green at a really harsh angle. Moving on to Warlock of the Wood singles. This is Necromancy, and it does feel a little bit soft in the pan, but not necessarily pasty. And this one is very interesting because it looks like it's going to be very opaque in the pan, but it actually swatches a little bit sheer. Has a little bit of a grayish base, and I'm going to put on a second layer just so we can see how it builds up. Next shade is Alchemy. This one also is a little bit more sheer, has a little bit of a grayish base, and really bright green straight on, and this one is quite flaky in the pan. So it doesn't really feel squishy in that sense. It feels squishy and like the flakes are compressing together, but it's not like emollient. I'm gonna add a second layer. And then last shade is Transmutation. And this one is also quite sheer, and it actually kind of applies a little bit unevenly. So I'm going to go in with another layer. And this is like a really bright blue. And this one does feel a little bit emollient. I'm going to add another layer just to see. It really looks like it's going to be like a really dark blue in the pan. It's so interesting, but it's actually pretty sheer. It has like a little bit of a grayish base to it. Warlock of the Wood palette. This is Talisman, and this is a very smooth metallic shade. It's a little bit sparkly, but it's really mostly just very smooth, and this is a split pan, and here's what that looks like. When it's mixed, it looks a little bit grayish almost, with a green or blue flash depending on how you mix it, because you can see here I didn't fully mix it when I swirled my finger in there, so you can kind of see the two different shades there. Here's Cauldron. It feels a little bit thicker to the touch, and this one is ultra sparkly. Ultra sparkly, beautiful brown shade. Ultra sparkly and very opaque. And then Hemlock is also ultra sparkly. And it has a little bit of a darker, almost black base to it. And it's very interesting because I see like a silvery green and then like a really bright forest green shift in there. Witch of the Wildflower palette. This is Witch's Garden. Beautiful yellow. And it has a bunch of different flecks throughout it. So beautiful. This one reminds me in texture of the center shade from the Warlock of the Wood. Oh my goodness, it is so metallic, so shiny and opaque. Floriography is the split pan, and mine is predominantly that orange flashing color. So it kind of does take over, and this one is very flaky in the pan. That was not focusing at all. But it does spread out, but this one is a little bit squishy. And then the third shade is Genius Loci, and this one is beautiful dimensional purple. Feels just like a regular type of shimmer with extra shine and sparkle and smoothness. I'm going to layer it on a little bit more. Voiceover Millie here. I'm starting out with the Warlock of the Wood palette. So I didn't realize my mic wasn't on. Starting out with Wolfsbane on the innermost crease, and I'm building it up a little bit. And then next to it, I'm going in with Decay, which is super, super pigmented and opaque. And then on the outer corner, first going in with Tombstone. And then deepening out the outer corner with Blackthorn and just slowly blending it up, being careful not to mix it too much with Decay. And then for the shimmer, taking Cauldron, and I did miss my brush a little bit. This is an ultra sparkly shade. It definitely can be more sheared out if you wanted it to be, which is how it applies with a brush. But I did end up going in with my finger just to see how opaque I could get it. It definitely gives a little bit kind of like the effect, I feel like, of the Urban Decay Moon Dust shadows in the sense of scattered sparkles. And then on the inner corner, I'm taking one of the halves of the half of the pan of Talisman. Here's the first finished look. Next, using the Witch of the Wildflower palette, I'm taking first Iron Weed on the inner corner and just a little bit up into my crease. And then right next to it, Dandelion Tea. Both of these are very, very pigmented, very opaque. And then on the outer corner, taking Purple Toadflax, and I'm just kind of packing it on first. I did use the Natasha Denona eyeshadow primer, and it did stick down a little bit. So I think next time, if I was to use this primer with this formula, I would have went in first with Porcelain Berry and then blended Purple Toadflax into it. So it took a little bit of blending it out with Porcelain Berry. So I did go back and forth a bit to blend it out there. For the shimmer shadow, I'm taking Genius Loci, and I'm putting that onto the center to the outer corner of my eye. And I did miss my brush just to avoid a little bit more fallout. And the shade is so sparkly, very dimensional. And then for the inner lid, I went in with Floriography. And I did just pick up the orangey shade, which layered really nicely over the green and the yellow matte. I did wear both of the looks for a couple hours and I didn't have any creasing, which is definitely a good sign, especially on the Natasha Denona eyeshadow primer, because this one is definitely much more likely to crease on me because it is more like a concealer. So I'm excited to test out the shimmers on my regular Too Faced Shadow Insurance primer. And I'm just swooping that up. Here's the second finished look. So let's talk about the palettes first. These color stories are definitely right up my alley. Loving the color stories. There's so many looks I can create with this palette, and I love that it's a 9-pan and it is $39 and you have 3 beautiful shimmers and then just really well curated mattes. Love that there are 2 deeper mattes, a mid-tone matte, and then some lighter shades as well. Just love the tones in here, especially because this brown is definitely a more cooler toned brown. Very much gives me bark vibes. And I also love that none of the shimmers in here feel very emollient or squishy or anything like that. Talisman is definitely the most smoothest shade out of here, and then Cauldron, it has a little bit more texture to it, but it is so ultra sparkly, and the mattes perform beautifully. Onto Witch of the Wildflower, these mattes are so pigmented. I mean, this one right here, this one, all of them super pigmented, very bright, very opaque. The plum shade did stick down a little bit initially when I put on top of the Natasha Denona primer, and that is because that one remains a little bit tacky, and some really pigmented formulas such as this one, they do sometimes like to stick, but I was able to blend it out, so I will try it out on top of another primer just to really test it out more. I do always use my eyeshadow palettes off of camera before I do my monthly palette ranking, so stay tuned for my monthly palette ranking if you want to hear all my final thoughts on palettes, because I do use them and try them out some more so I can really get an idea on just the entirety of the whole palette. I unfortunately can't do 5 looks with each palette that comes into my collection. It's just not realistic, especially because I do the detail swatches and the comparison swatches as well. It's kind of like either I do the comparison swatches or I do more looks, and sometimes I'll also feature palettes in reels, so make sure you're following me on Instagram. As for the shimmers, there is one squishy shade, which is the kind of tie-dye shade in the center, and I feel like because mine had that orangey shade in it, like predominantly, like most of the pan was taken up by this orange shade, it did kind of take over, especially when I was swatching it. So I think the way that that shade looks is going to depend on what your pan looks like how is it split? Is it more evenly split? So that's something to keep in mind, and that's why I don't do comparison swatches with these tie-dye kind of shades, because they do mix a little bit differently depending on the time. But as I mentioned, the orange definitely took over. Love the shade, but it is a little bit squishy. The other 2 shades are not squishy, they are sparkly, and the shade right here has a bunch of different flecks throughout it, so it is a very beautiful dimensional shade. So moving on to the single shadows, for the most part they are a little bit on the flaky side, especially these 2 shades right here, as well as the iridescent. In the detailed swatch section, I did call out which shade was a little bit more on the squishy side, a little bit more on the emollient side, so I will definitely have to try these out on the lids and keep you updated with wear time. It really varies, because I've also noticed that sometimes a shade feels kind of a little bit more squishy in the pan because it is so flaky, and the flakes have a little bit more kind of like space in between the pigment particles, the flakies essentially, and so that when you push down, it's kind of like pushing down a bunch of feathers where they kind of compress down, so it's kind of hard for me to tell. I do kind of suspect definitely this shade and this shade. It does feel like the way it picks up and the way it spreads, it does feel a little bit more emollient. I love this shade selection. I love this kind of shade, and then this one also is a really punchy. This one is a great one and done type of shadow, or throw a matte in the crease. Super sparkly, very dimensional. And then this one surprised me a little bit because it does have a grayish base to it, and from looking at it in the pan you really can't tell, and it also definitely takes a little bit of building up. So these are just some of my first impression thoughts on this collection, and congratulations to Monica and Lee on bringing their vision to life. Let me know in the comments below if you plan on picking anything up. I would love to hear your thoughts, and that's everything for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you next time.